The prairie stretches out in every direction, rolling grasslands under a sky so wide it swallows the horizon. A lone rider urges his horse forward, the leather of his saddle creaking softly, the steady rhythm of hooves carrying him across miles of open country. His breath fogs in the early morning air, his stomach growls. He reaches into a small pouch tied to his belt and pulls out a hard, compact piece of pemmican, a mixture of dried buffalo meat, melted fat, and crushed berries. He chews slowly, savoring the faint sweetness of chokecherries mixed with the richness of buffalo fat. It isn't much. It may have to last him the entire day, maybe longer. For this scout, food isn't just about flavor, it's survival. Scouts were the eyes and ears of the Lakota people. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Lakota roamed the vast Great Plains, a scout's duty could mean the difference between life and death for their community. They guided war parties toward rival camps. They tracked the movements of buffalo herds. They carried messages across hundreds of miles, often alone, through harsh weather and hostile territory. But here's the question. How did they fuel themselves for such grueling journeys? Imagine riding for days at a time, covering 50, 60, even 70 miles in a single stretch with no guarantee of a hot meal waiting at the end. What foods kept a Lakota scout alive, strong, and alert when every ounce of energy mattered? That's what we're exploring today. We're going to step into the world of the Lakota scout and look at their travel diet, what they carried with them, what they foraged along the way, how they preserved food for months, and how each bite carried not only nourishment but also spiritual meaning. Let's start with the foundation, the staple foods Lakota scouts carried with them, and nothing was more important than pemmican. Pemmican was the kind of high-energy power bar of the plains. The process of making it was meticulous. First, strips of buffalo meat were sliced thin and dried in the sun or smoked over a low fire until they became brittle, almost like wood shavings. Then, the meat was pounded with stone tools until it turned into a fine powder. This powder was mixed with rendered buffalo fat, sometimes called tallow, which gave it both flavor and longevity. To this, dried chokecherries or even service berries might be added, giving the mixture a slight tang and added nutrition. The final product was pressed into dense cakes or stored in rawhide bags. Properly sealed, it could last for months, sometimes years, without spoiling. For a scout, pemmican was perfect. It was light, it was portable, and it packed enormous calories in a small volume. A single bite could deliver enough energy to ride for hours. And unlike fresh meat, it required no cooking, ideal when you were traveling fast and trying to avoid drawing attention with smoke from a fire. But pemmican wasn't the only food in the scout's pouch. Jerky, thin, dried strips of buffalo, deer, or elk, was also common. It wasn't as calorie-dense as pemmican, but it was chewy, salty, and satisfying. Sometimes, jerky could be boiled in water to make a quick broth, softening it into something more digestible after days of gnawing on dry strips. Alongside these meats, scouts often carried small amounts of dried corn. While corn wasn't as central to the Lakota diet as it was to other tribes further east, trade with agricultural nations like the Mandan or Omaha meant dried kernels or parched corn occasionally made their way into travel stores. A scout could soak the corn overnight, or chew it dry if desperate, gaining a little starch and variety in his diet. These foods, pemmican, jerky, dried corn, formed the portable rations of a Lakota scout. But out on the trail, those alone weren't always enough. The Great Plains might look empty at first glance, just grass and sky. But to a skilled scout, the land was a pantry. One of the most important foraged foods was the prairie turnip, known to the Lakota as timsita, This root grew wild across the plains and was a staple for generations. Scouts could dig it up with a digging stick, peel off the fibrous skin, and eat it raw for a crisp, slightly sweet crunch, something like a mild radish mixed with a potato. More often, though, prairie turnips were dried in thin slices and carried as trail food. A handful of dried timsila provided starch, fiber, and variety, filling in the gaps between meat-heavy meals. Wild fruits also offered bursts of energy. Chokecherries were especially prized. Small, dark, and tart, they could be eaten fresh in season or dried and added to pemmican. Other berries like buffalo berries or wild plums might be collected along the way if the season was right. Imagine the relief of biting into something juicy and sweet after days of nothing but dried meat. Nuts, too, made their way into the scouts' diet. Walnuts and acorns could be found in certain regions, though they weren't as abundant on the open prairie. Still, when available, they provided fats and proteins that helped balance the constant meat intake. And then there was the matter of fish. If a scout's route crossed rivers or streams, there was always the chance to catch something with a quick spear, net, or even bare hands in shallow water. Roasting a small fish over a hidden fire not only gave protein, but also broke the monotony of travel rations. All of this required sharp observation. A scout wasn't just a tracker of enemies or buffalo. He was a tracker of edible plants, seasonal fruits, and hidden water sources. Knowledge of the land was as vital as the weapons he carried. Of course, no matter how well prepared a scout was, food stores could run out. That meant turning to opportunistic hunting. On the move, scouts didn't have time to bring down a buffalo or elk. Those hunts required groups, preparation, and stamina. Instead, they relied on small game, animals that could be killed quickly, butchered swiftly, and eaten with minimal effort. Rabbits were a common choice. A well-aimed arrow or even a thrown club could bring down a rabbit, and the meat could be roasted in minutes. Prairie birds like grouse or prairie chickens offered the same benefit. Easy to catch, easy to cook. The key was speed. A scout might roast meat quickly over coals or simply sear it enough to kill surface bacteria before moving on. Sometimes the meat was only half cooked, a choice made not for taste, but for survival, to minimize the time spent with a fire that could betray his position. Bones could be cracked for marrow, which provided fat and a surprisingly satisfying flavor. Nothing went to waste. Every scrap was fuel for the next mile.